August 1942. In the Solomon Islands, America launched its first major offensive of the Pacific War. The target, Guadalcanal, a jungle island with an unfinished airfield that could decide control of the South Pacific. For the Marines landing on its black beaches, it was more than a mission. It was a gamble to seize the initiative and prove that Japan could be beaten. What followed was 6 months of brutal fighting, on land, at sea, and in the skies. This is the story of Guadalcanal. In the summer of 1942, after the Japanese Empire's initial lightning victories across the Pacific, the balance of the war began to shift. In May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy halted Japan's advance, and just a month later, at Midway, they achieved a decisive victory that shattered Japan's carrier supremacy, the backbone of its fleet. These successes opened the door for the Allies to seize the initiative for the first time. Against this backdrop, Allied military leaders resolved to launch their first counteroffensive against enemy strongholds. The chosen target was the Solomon Islands, particularly Guadalcanal, where the Japanese were hastily constructing an airfield that could threaten the vital sea lanes linking the United States with Australia. The landing operation, codenamed Watchtower, was quickly drawn up, with the critical mission of capturing Guadalcanal and nearby islands to halt Japan's expansion. This marked the Allies' first major offensive after months of retreat and passive defense. At dawn on August 7, 1942, the Allied fleet closed in on the shores of Guadalcanal and nearby islands under the cover of stormy weather, avoiding detection by the Japanese. Exploiting the element of surprise, nearly 19,000 U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, stormed ashore. On Tulagi and the smaller surrounding islands, the Japanese garrisons fought fiercely, but were ultimately wiped out or scattered. On Guadalcanal itself, only about 2,000 Japanese soldiers and laborers were present, working on an unfinished airfield. Caught off guard, they fled into the jungle. Within just 2 days, the Americans secured Guadalcanal along with the incomplete airstrip at Lunga Point. The position was quickly fortified into a defensive bridgehead, and the airfield was named Henderson Field in honor of a Marine pilot killed at Midway. Securing Henderson was of vital importance, as it allowed the Allies to control the skies and seas around the island. Japan's response was swift. On the night of August 8th to 9th, as Allied transport ships were still unloading supplies on the beaches, a Japanese task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa launched a surprise attack near Savo Island. In a chaotic half-hour night battle, later known as the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese struck a devastating blow, sinking 4 Allied cruisers, 3 American and 1 Australian, and heavily damaging another, while suffering almost no losses themselves. It was the worst naval disaster in U.S. history up to that time. Fearing daylight airstrikes, however, Mikawa withdrew before destroying the vulnerable Allied transports. Even so, the heavy losses forced Admiral Turner to pull the Allied fleet out of Guadalcanal on August 9th, abandoning roughly 11,000 Marines on the island. They now faced a desperate situation, short on heavy weapons, with only 2 weeks' worth of food, and reduced to 2 meals a day. Despite being left alone, the Marines quickly dug in, establishing a defensive perimeter around Henderson Field at Lunga Point. During the first week, they dragged artillery and supplies inland while rushing to complete the runway with captured Japanese equipment. Remarkably, within just 4 days, Henderson was operational. On August 20th, the escort carrier USS Long Island secretly approached and delivered 31 aircraft, Wildcat fighters and Dauntless bombers to the airfield. This composite unit, Nicknamed the Cactus Air Force, after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal, immediately entered combat, shooting down Japanese planes and providing crucial support to ground forces. With their help, U.S. troops repelled Japanese probing attacks near the Matanikau River and even sank a small transport carrying 113 Japanese troops attempting to land west of the Lunga perimeter. Yet hardship pressed in from all sides. Tropical diseases began to take their toll. Within weeks, 1 in 5 Marines had contracted dysentery. Supplies were scarce, the climate harsh, and the men battled swarms of mosquitoes alongside the enemy. Everyone knew the fiercest trials on Guadalcanal were still to come. Determined to retake Guadalcanal, the Japanese High Command immediately launched a counteroffensive. On the night of August 18, 1942, the first detachment of about 900 infantrymen from the Ichiki Regiment, under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, was secretly landed by destroyers on the island's eastern shore, roughly 35 kilometers from Henderson Field. Although ordered to reconnoiter and await reinforcements, Ichiki, overconfident and eager for glory, led his men through the jungle and reached the American defenses along Alligator Creek at dawn on August 21st. There, he recklessly ordered a direct banzai charge. The initial surprise was quickly shattered as the Marines' overwhelming firepower cut the attackers down. By daylight, the Americans counterattacked with tanks and artillery, annihilating the remnants on the sandbar at the river mouth. The Battle of Tanaru ended in catastrophe for the Japanese. Nearly the entire unit was destroyed, with only a few dozen survivors retreating. Colonel Ichiki himself was killed, reportedly by suicide after witnessing his regiment's destruction. This first clash at Guadalcanal proved that U.S. Marines could decisively defeat Japanese infantry in the jungle, shattering the myth of the Empire's invincibility. Almost immediately after Tanaru, Japan prepared a larger campaign to reclaim the island. In late August, convoys from Rabaul sailed south with reinforcements, while the U.S. Pacific Fleet, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, deployed the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga with their escorts to intercept. On August 24, 1942, the two forces clashed in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. In the fierce carrier battle, Japan's light carrier Ryujo was sunk, while Enterprise suffered heavy bomb damage and had to withdraw to Hawaii for repairs. Japan's transport plans collapsed after one supply ship was destroyed, and Admiral Tanaka's flagship Jinsu was damaged. The following morning, August 25th, dive bombers flying from Guadalcanal pursued the Japanese convoy, sinking the destroyer Mutsuki and forcing Tanaka to retreat. As a result, Japan failed to land significant reinforcements on Guadalcanal throughout August, giving the Americans valuable time to strengthen Henderson Field. From late August into September 1942, the campaign settled into a tense stalemate. Each night, Japanese destroyers, dubbed the Tokyo Express by the Allies, raced in under cover of darkness to land troops and bombard Henderson Field, withdrawing before dawn. By day, the Cactus Air Force and American artillery struck back, targeting Japanese positions, aircraft, and warships. The stretch of water between Guadalcanal and Florida Island soon earned the name Iron Bottom Sound, as dozens of ships from both sides went to the bottom in savage naval battles. On land, U.S. forces launched repeated probes and small offensives westward, clashing with Japanese units along the Matanikau River. The jungle terrain, relentless tropical weather, and rampant malaria gradually drained the strength of both armies. On September 15th, disaster struck the U.S. Navy when the carrier USS Wasp was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine while returning from escort duty. Still, Allied resolve held firm. Both sides braced for the larger, decisive battles that would determine the fate of Guadalcanal. In mid-September 1942, Japan launched its first major ground counteroffensive aimed at breaking the American perimeter around Henderson Field. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi assembled about 6,000 elite troops from the 35th Infantry Brigade and secretly marched them through the jungle from the south. On the night of September 12th, flares lit up the dark sky as the assault began. The Japanese charged furiously toward Edson's Ridge, a vital hill guarding the southern approach to Henderson, defended by just 800 U.S. Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion under Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, quickly turned into a fight for survival. For 2 nights, September 12th to 14th, savage combat raged in the pitch-black tropical jungle. Japanese troops repeatedly broke through the lines, reaching halfway up the hill amid a chaos of gunfire, grenades, and shouted charges. The Marines held on desperately, often fighting to the last man. Many positions were overrun and retaken several times in a single night. At dawn on the 14th, American reinforcements sealed the gaps and counterattacked, driving the Japanese down the slopes. By midday, the ridge was littered with bodies. Over 600 Japanese lay dead, compared to just 40 U.S. Marines. Once again, Japan's attempt to seize Henderson ended in failure. The victory lifted Allied morale, and Colonel Edson was awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership. For the Japanese, the bitter defeat underscored that retaking Guadalcanal would require far greater numbers and determination. After Edson's Ridge, both sides pulled back to regroup and prepare for a decisive confrontation. In October 1942, Japan poured massive reinforcements into the Guadalcanal gamble, dispatching the 2nd Infantry Division and other elite units, raising their strength on the island to about 30,000 men by the end of the month. The Americans also reinforced. Though exhausted, the 1st Marine Division held on, supported by the arrival of the 7th Marines, engineers, artillery, and, on October 13th, the U.S. Army's 164th Regiment of the American Division, the first regular Army unit to fight on Guadalcanal. At sea, Japan continued bold strikes. On the night of October 11th, a Japanese surface force approached to bombard Henderson, but was intercepted at Cape Esperance by Rear Admiral Norman Scott's U.S. task force. In the ensuing night battle, the Americans won their first clear naval victory, sinking a cruiser and a destroyer and forcing the rest to retreat. Though small in scale, it marked a turning point in Allied naval confidence. Yet just 2 weeks later, on October 26th, Japan struck back in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Exploiting the fact that only USS Enterprise remained in service, Vice Admiral Nagumo launched his main carrier force, including Shokaku and Zuikaku. In the battle, USS Hornet was sunk, and Enterprise was heavily damaged, but the Japanese lost dozens of aircraft and many veteran pilots. Tactically, Santa Cruz was a temporary Japanese victory. The U.S. Navy was left without operational carriers in the area. Strategically, however, Japan had failed again to eliminate Henderson Field or crush the American foothold. The defenders held firm, reinforcements kept coming, and the struggle for Guadalcanal was now entering its most decisive and brutal phase. By late October 1942, Japan's 17th Army under General Harukichi Hyakutaka launched its largest offensive of the campaign, determined to overrun the defenses around Henderson Field. Over 15,000 Japanese troops advanced in multiple columns, moving under cover of darkness from both the west and the south. On the night of October 24th, the assault began. To the west, some 2,000 men, supported by tanks, tried to cross the Matanikau River, but blundered into an ambush. American artillery and anti-tank guns destroyed nearly all the armor, breaking the attack. The decisive fighting came on the southern front, where nearly 3,000 men of Japan's 2nd Infantry Division, commanded by General Masao Maruyama, struck the thin defenses of the U.S. 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Only about 700 Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller held the line against an enemy many times their number. For 2 nights, October 24th to 25th, the battle raged with brutal intensity. Marine positions fought in isolation, but held firm, led by steadfast, non-commissioned officers like Sergeant John Basilone, who would later be awarded the Medal of Honor for mowing down hundreds of attackers during the night. Flares, mortars, and machine guns lit up the jungle. Japanese dead piled up before the trenches. By dawn on October 26th, the final assaults had been repulsed, leaving thousands of Japanese casualties. Reinforcements from the U.S. Army's 164th Regiment arrived just in time to strengthen the line, joining the Marines in holding Henderson Field. The clash ended in a decisive American victory. At least 1,500 Japanese were killed, crippling the combat strength of the 17th Army. From that point forward, Japan would never again mount a major ground offensive on Guadalcanal. The defeat plunged Japanese command into a grim dilemma. Their finest units had been thrown into the meat grinder of Guadalcanal, yet they had failed to breach Henderson's defenses. In the skies, the Cactus Air Force maintained daytime supremacy, thwarting raids and blocking supply runs. On the ground, Japanese troops starved and sickened. Supply ships were sunk by American planes, forcing men to survive on weeds and muddy water. Many collapsed not from bullets but from malaria and exhaustion. In November, sensing the tide turning after the defensive victory, the Allies prepared to finish the campaign. General Alexander Vandegrift was replaced by General Alexander Patch, commander of the U.S. Corps and American strength on the island swelled to more than 44,000 men as reinforcements poured in. Japan, however, refused to give up. In early November, the Imperial General Headquarters ordered an all-out effort, coordinating Army, Navy, and Air Forces. A massive convoy would attempt to land reinforcements, while a powerful fleet steamed toward Savo Island to engage the U.S. Navy and bombard Henderson Field into rubble. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought from November 12 to 15, 1942, was the bloodiest climax of the entire campaign. On November 12th, American intelligence detected a convoy of 11 Japanese transports carrying about 7,000 troops and heavy weapons toward the island. Protecting them was a formidable force including the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, along with cruisers and destroyers ordered to bombard Guadalcanal during the night of November 12th to 13th. U.S. aircraft attacked throughout the day, but failed to prevent the Japanese from advancing. With the situation dire, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan was ordered to intercept with a hastily assembled group of cruisers and destroyers. Shortly after midnight on November 13th, the two fleets collided in the darkness off Guadalcanal at point-blank range. Ships intermingled chaotically, firing guns and launching torpedoes at just a few hundred meters. In only 24 minutes of savage fighting, the Americans managed to block the Japanese advance, but at terrible cost. The battleship Hiei was crippled and later sank in Iron Bottom Sound. The U.S., however, lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, with several others badly damaged. Both Admirals Callahan and Norman Scott were killed in action. Yet the sacrifice forced Japan to abandon its planned bombardment of Henderson Field that night. On the morning of November 13th, while the Japanese surface fleet withdrew, Allied aircraft swarmed over the convoy, dive bombers and B-17s pounding the transports and sinking most before they could reach Guadalcanal. The following night, November 13th to 14th, Japanese cruisers attempted a brief bombardment of Henderson, but inflicted little damage. On the night of November 15th, Japan made one final desperate effort. Admiral Kondo led Kirishima and an escort force into the strait between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. This time, the Americans were ready. Admiral Willis Lee lay in ambush with the battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota. Near midnight, the two sides clashed. The 16-inch guns of Washington delivered devastating blows, setting Kirishima ablaze and sinking her within hours. The heavy cruiser Kinugasa was also sunk by air attack. The U.S. lost 3 destroyers to torpedoes, and South Dakota was heavily damaged, but the Japanese fleet was decisively repulsed. By dawn, the surviving 4 transports were either sunk by American aircraft or deliberately run aground. Thousands of Japanese troops were killed at sea, while most survivors who reached shore were too exhausted and starving to fight. The victory in mid-November ended Japan's last hope of reinforcing Guadalcanal. By December 1942, the balance of power had completely shifted in favor of the Allies. Japan could only cling on in desperation. U.S. naval and air forces dominated the Solomon skies and seas, cutting off supplies entirely. On land, American troops launched steady attacks to squeeze Japanese strongholds in the island's west, winning brutal clashes around the Gifu Strongpoint, Mount Austin, and the village of Tassafaronga. Though the Japanese resisted fiercely, American firepower and reinforcements steadily crushed them. After more than 5 months of attrition, Japan's high command finally accepted reality. On December 31st, Emperor Hirohito approved the evacuation of Guadalcanal. Operation K, the withdrawal plan, was carried out in secrecy in late January 1943 under the cover of remaining naval forces. On the night of February 7th, the last Japanese troops slipped away aboard destroyers. At dawn on February 9th, U.S. forces occupied the remaining positions without resistance. After 6 months of relentless combat, the Guadalcanal campaign officially ended. The Allies had secured their first major strategic victory against the Japanese Empire in the Pacific War. The Battle of Guadalcanal was one of the decisive turning points of World War II, but the price of victory was staggering. The Allies suffered around 7,000 dead. The United States alone lost more than 1,600 men and had over 4,200 wounded on land, not including the heavy toll at sea and deaths from disease in the tropical jungle. Japan's losses were far greater. An estimated 24,000 soldiers, sailors, and elite pilots perished on Guadalcanal. Tragically, many did not fall to bullets or bombs, but to starvation, malaria, and exhaustion. The material losses were equally devastating. Each side lost roughly 20 warships over the course of the campaign. The Japanese Navy left beneath the waters of Iron Bottom Sound the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, a light carrier, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and numerous submarines. The Allies, too, paid dearly, losing the carriers USS Wasp and USS Hornet, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. In the skies, over 600 aircraft were destroyed or shot down. Guadalcanal became a massive graveyard of men and machines, so much so that soldiers from both sides called it the Island of Hell. Yet behind the enormous sacrifice lay a strategic victory of historic importance. For the first time, the Allies not only repelled, but decisively defeated a major Japanese offensive on land, while also blunting their power at sea and in the air. After Guadalcanal, Japan was forced to relinquish the strategic initiative and shift to the defensive across the Pacific. For the United States and its allies, what had begun in weakness now turned into strength. Guadalcanal provided a secure foothold for launching the island-hopping offensives that would gradually reclaim territory from Japanese control. The tragic last station of Japan's imperial advance entered history not only as a symbol of ferocity and loss, but also as proof of the resilience and sacrifice of tens of thousands of men. It opened the long, grueling, but ultimately victorious road to liberating Asia and the Pacific from Japanese militarism.